Hey everyone, this is our weekly Zoom apologetics call, and we're going to be talking about defining faith correctly tonight. So I hope that you receive something here that you can use in your discussions with others, and maybe learn some things as well that obviously that builds your faith up. So let's dive right in. So we obviously want to try to clear up some confusion here because there is a lot of confusion out there in our culture about how to define faith, what it is and what it isn't, what it is and what it isn't. So there's a guy named Mark Twain. I assume you know who he is if you read any of his books. Huckleberry Finn, of course. We all had to read that in elementary school. But he once said that faith is believing what you know ain't so. This is obviously a very uh, simplistic view of what faith is, and it's incorrect as far as what biblical faith is. So he's saying that you really don't know anything; you just believe. So that's kind of a very sad way of believing. Looking at the Bible and thinking that's what biblical faith is, because that's completely incorrect. And then we've had some atheists come along over the years, last 10 to 15 years, the big popular atheists, and of course they have their misunderstandings as well. You have a guy named Peter Boghossian, who wrote a book called A Manual for Creating Atheists. He taught at Portland State University philosophy there. He's actually left the university. He's tired of all the critical race theory and all that stuff, but that's a whole other story. But anyway, he said, faith is pretending to know what you don't know. And then we had the famous atheist Richard Dawkins, who said, faith is belief without evidence and reason. Coincidentally, that's also the definition of delusion. And then we had Sam Harris say that faith is generally nothing more than the permission religious people give one another to believe things strongly without evidence. So all three of these definitions are a complete misunderstanding. And then we have another Dawkins quote where he said, faith is the great cop out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps lack of, or because of the lack of evidence. So total misunderstanding, once again, of what biblical faith is, but I wouldn't expect these gentlemen to understand it because they don't really study the Bible and they don't understand how we've interpreted faith throughout the years, and they probably don't care, to be honest. They haven't taken a lot of time to look into it, and they probably just have already written it off without giving it a fair hearing. But anyway, one thing for sure, they all seem to assume that these definitions we've seen, they all seem to assume that when we say we have faith, that we don't have any knowledge, we don't know anything, and that is not correct. When we say that we have biblical faith, we're saying that we do have knowledge. We actually know something. That's what it means when you say to know or not know. You have knowledge or you don't have knowledge. And we believe we have knowledge, okay, of who God is and what his plans are for humanity. So it's not divorced from knowledge, contrary to what popular media says and popular atheist writings. Now, we have an object, right? Because faith has an object. You can't have faith in faith. And the object of our faith, of course, is the one true God. I'll talk more about this, but if you think a couple passages here, like the one in John 17:3, where Jesus says, now this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you sent. Notice he says, this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only one true God, the only true God. So the true God that Jesus is talking about is the same God that is talked about in Exodus 20 to 2:3, when God said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So it's the God of Israel that Jesus is talking, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Of course, he's the God of the nations as well. But the point is that it's, sometimes you read John 17:3, we forget that Jesus is talking about a very specific God here. And it is the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, that means that the object of our faith is not just like in a higher power. A lot of people think it's really trendy to say I'm spiritual, not religious. I believe in a higher power. I believe in a spiritual realm. But they really don't have any definition of their higher power. There's no way to know anything about the higher power. They're vague when they say it. There's just no accountability to this higher power. There's no moral constraints. It's just basically just belief in some very vague higher power. So that's not what we're talking about, of course, when we talk about the object of our faith, biblically speaking. And Gray Kokel has a great definition here. I think it's very helpful when he says, or a great statement, I should say, when he says, Christians do not use faith in order to discover knowledge. Rather, faith is the response to knowledge they've already obtained by some other means. And so if we apply that to biblical faith, we are responding to what God has revealed to us. God has to initiate communication and contact with humans. He's got to do something to communicate what he wants for us, or else we wouldn't know anything. And just like all human relationships are formed through initiation, email, talking, verbal communication, writing things, many forms of communication today. But just like we initiate communication with other friends or humans, that's how God does it with us. He initiates the communication process, and he reveals knowledge to us. He reveals what he wants us to know. Now, the question is whether we respond to it. That's always been the case, right? And some people do and some people don't. And so when we do campus outreach and we have the big sign that we use, does God exist? And a lot of students check off the category here, whether yes, no, or I don't know. We generally see most of the time when students say yes, the reason they say yes is creation. They'll say, well, it's clear that God has revealed himself through the world around them. They say it's just so obvious that, there's no way that everything could have come together through chance and time. So generally, they're responding to some sort of revelation God has given, which is what we call natural revelation, as we'll talk about in a minute. But they definitely are responding to the belief, something that we already believe is talked about. We agree with them that, you don't need the Bible to know there's a creator. God has given knowledge of all humanity. All humanity should know there is a creator. Even if you've never read Romans 1, you don't need to read Romans 1. That's why many people believe in God. They don't even need to open the Bible. They'll say, well, just look around you. Creation speaks of a God, speaks of a creator. And obviously, so God does give knowledge of himself through the natural world. And of course, through history as well, as we'll talk about. You can't have all knowledge. You can't just learn everything about God through looking at the world of nature. But the point is that he chose to reveal himself in a greater way through the world of history. So when you look at the passage that Paul talks about in Romans 1, when he talks about that God has shown people who he is through the creation of the world, through what has been made. Notice he says through what has been made. That means that you should be able to look at features of reality in the natural world and do cause and effect, or look at the cause and effect relationships. You see the effect, you obviously say there's a cause for that effect. I see the effects in the world. God reveals himself through the effects. We can't see God directly, which is a good thing, because as we know, as he told Moses, if you see me, you'll die. And so we can't see God in all his glory or all his fullness, but he reveals himself through the things that have been made. And so we can make an inference and reason back from an effect to a cause. That's what we do when we look at whether it be the universe or whether it be some feature of the human body or whether it be some other design we see, something, that we point back to God, that he is the cause of that effect. And so that's why a lot of students, college students, they agree, God, the creation reveals knowledge of God. And that's what we believe. We don't agree with this. We don't agree that the universe was produced by a mindless, non-conscious, non-moral process. We do not agree that human beings were produced by an undirected, valueless process. We don't believe that life somehow emerged from non-living matter. And we do not think that there was just a ton of other universes out there which are completely unobservable, as we know, right? I can't observe any of them. But the point is that to say all the cosmic constants just happen to be right, and given enough time, a universe just popped out that allows us to exist. It just happened to be the right universe without any God behind it. It just did it. So we do not agree with that. We think that there's intentionality behind the universe. There's intent, that it's not accidental, that it shows planning. And planet Earth shows planning. You have to have the right universe before you have the right Earth, and you have to have the right Earth before you get life going. So there's a lot of planning that has to happen, and planning comes from a mind, thinking ahead. That's the teleological argument. There's an end goal, as we say, an end goal that's seen. And the end goal of the universe is that planet Earth to be set up for life. So we don't accept this, and many college students don't. Of course, there are atheists out there, but I'm saying that when they say yes to the God question, they mostly say creation is one of the main ways they know God exists. You can read more about that in Stephen Meyer's book, Return of the God Hypothesis. There's all kinds of information in there. Now, sometimes people say that, well, faith is just like a God of the gaps argument, where you just fill in a feature of the natural world that can't be explained, and then suddenly you just say God did it, and I have faith that God did it. And so people say sometimes, well, that's just a bad God of the gaps argument. You might hear that a lot when you talk about the beginning of the universe, the design of the universe, and you say God did it, and people say, oh, you're just invoking God, and there's going to be some natural explanation one day, and some nature will explain it, something in the natural realm will explain it. And so really what they end up doing is forgetting that there are more than one kind of causes out there. There's no doubt that everything around you bears witness to some things that aren't naturally caused. Obviously, you know that. Just about everything around this room I'm looking at right now is not natural. It was designed by somebody or some mind. Now, obviously, that's a very simple illustration, but the point is that there's more than one cause out there. It's not just natural. Okay, there's all kinds of things that point to intelligence, and we make design inferences in nature all the time. But when people say they complain about the God of the gaps argument, and they say, well, you have faith in some God that explains that, and nature, the science will answer it someday. We'll find some naturalist explanation. Well, they're really just appealing to the nature of the gaps argument. That's where they think nature will fill in every gap in knowledge. See, that's their worldview. They start with nature as all there is, and then they say nature can explain this and can explain that, and it'll explain that one day. And nature on its own. No mind behind it, a mindless process, no intelligence behind it. Nature just knows what to do. It's just rigged by nobody, but it just knows what to do. And so, we find that to be ridiculous. Obviously we believe also God is behind the natural world anyway. There wouldn't be any natural causes without God, because there were no natural laws before the universe came into existence. So anyway, just remember that when someone brings up the gaps argument. And of course, as I said, we think we see traces of God in the universe, in the world, and in humans, in the design of the universe, the design of the earth, the design of humans, the design of the human cell, DNA, or consciousness. We believe there's a moral law that transcends all people groups and cultures, and then people seem to really matter. We fight for human dignity, equality, and value. Humans seem to really matter. So there's something special about humans, even though people say we're not special. They say we're just a chance accident, we're just molecules in motion. We seem to treat people as if they're more than just molecules in motion. Okay. So knowledge of God that comes to the natural world is knowledge, that God reveals knowledge to us. So our faith has knowledge, but that's only going to be a partial knowledge. We won't learn everything about God through just observing the natural world. We won't know that God is a Trinity. We won't know much about his moral attributes, whether he's merciful, kind, just, righteous, holy. We don't learn all these things about God through just studying the natural world. So that's why we think that we need God to speak through history, that God has to do something where he communicates in a greater way, and we believe he does that he speaks to us through the person and work of Jesus, of course, and through a text. He gave us the Bible to read, and we can find out more about God through reading the Bible. That's knowledge of God. God's giving knowledge of himself through a text. And if you want to read more about Jesus, of course, these are some fine writings. You can go deeper on some history here about why we think he is the Jewish Messiah and the Messiah of the nations. But anyway, now we need to remember that people could have knowledge that God exists and knowledge of who Jesus is, but not have genuine faith or saving faith. For example, if you look at the demon-possessed man in Mark 5, when Jesus does this exorcism here, and this man comes to him, and this Jesus sees this man, and he sees Jesus from a distance, and the demon is inside this man, and he says to Jesus, what do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High? In God's name, don't torture me. And then Jesus, of course, says, come out of this man, you impure spirit. But the point is that demon recognizes who Jesus is. He has knowledge of who Jesus is. But obviously he doesn't have real genuine faith or saving faith. It's just a knowledge, just like I might say, yeah, I know who President Biden is. Of course I know who he is. I have knowledge of that. And if I saw him somewhere in public, I'd acknowledge, hey, there's President Biden. But, that's just a general surface knowledge. It doesn't mean I have any relationship with President Biden. It doesn't mean I really know President Biden in any intimate way, because I don't really know him, right? I've never been introduced to him. I don't spend time with him. I probably never will, and many of us won't. But the point is that, so you can have knowledge of God, but it's not saving faith. Same with James 2:18-19, where you say, or where it says in James, it says, you have faith and I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I'll show you my faith by my deeds. You believe that there's one God, good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. So the demons believe that God exists. See, they have belief that God exists, but they don't have trust in the one true God, right? They don't have saving faith as well. So it's not enough just to believe that God exists or that Jesus is the Son of God. And when you get into people or talk to people that simply maybe just have some knowledge of the facts, like, yeah, I know, I claim to be a Christian. I know I'm supposed to believe Jesus died and rose from the dead. And I know, yeah, I believe in God, or I believe, I say I believe, and I have some knowledge, but they don't really have genuine faith. And this is where we get into nominalism, where a lot of people attend churches, and I've run into this everywhere on campus as well, where they really only have a surface level of what Christianity is. They're not really in the faith. They don't really have genuine saving faith. Jesus has no impact on their lives. They're not living for him. They've never made a commitment to him. All they have is maybe some cultural Christianity. They maybe went through communion or went through confirmation class, but they've never made any kind of commitment to Jesus. Now, maybe they just don't know they're supposed to. That's what happened to me. But the point is that there's a lot of nominalism out there. So you got to be aware of that. And that comes from just thinking that if they just know a few things about Jesus or a few facts, that's good enough, but that's not going to cut it. So what we want to remember here is that the words faith and believe, as you see in your English translations, those are not Greek. Obviously, they're English translations of Greek terminology. I mean, that's not the Greek, what the Greek is for faith. The thing that you want to remember especially is number 3, that we talk about the Greek word for faith, pistis. The real genuine definition of biblical faith is faithfulness, reliability, fidelity, commitment, or we could say trust. But trust always leads to trustworthiness in the one true God, or we could say faith leads to faithfulness. You can't divorce those from each other. But the point is that it leads to true, genuine faith involves fidelity and commitment. It's not just mental assent. Now, obviously, there is mental, there is a cognitive part of it, but it's not all there is. And so look at where if you substitute the word pistis here instead of faith in Paul's writings in Titus 2:10, where Paul says that slaves should not steal, but should display all good pistis towards their masters. So if you follow it and you realize pistis means faithfulness, reliability, fidelity, and commitment, Paul's saying that the slaves should trust themselves to their masters, or not, they should, and I'm sorry, Paul's not saying that slaves should entirely trust in their masters, rather they should show complete faithfulness or loyalty to them. That's a big difference. And then you have something similar in Matthew's gospel, where number 5 here, where Jesus rebukes the Pharisees for neglecting the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and pistis. That's what we mean by faith, right? And Jesus is saying they're demonstrating in their behavior a lack of faithfulness or fidelity to God and his law. So we need to have a understanding, once again, that the words faith and believe are just translations, right? So you want to be thinking along those lines: faithfulness, trust, reliability, fidelity, commitment. Okay. That's why when you think of believing faith or biblical faith, believing faith definitely is cognitively active. It means that it does involve your cognition. You have to think and use your brain, your mind. Yes, obviously. When you pick your spouse, if you get married, you use your mind, you use your cognition, and you mentally think, yeah, this is the right person for me, right? But that's not going to be enough to involve a commitment. You have to move down to number 2, where you have trusting faith, which is volitionally active. That involves your volition or your will. For example, like, as I'll show you an illustration here in a minute, when you get up to the altar on a wedding day and you take that step of trust and believe in your spouse and commit to them, that involves your will, right? You're volitionally acting. And when you obviously make that decision, you probably have sufficient reasons for why you're making that commitment. So we'll talk more about in a minute. So, example, when you get up, when you're dating your wife or your future spouse, and you build your fact base, like, okay, as far as my knowledge base, it seems like this is the right person. I have some facts now about them. I've learned about them. I've gotten to know them. Now I know I didn't know them at all. Now I know them. I have some knowledge about them. There may be some level of uncertainty still when you get up to the altar or have some questions unanswered because you can't see into the future. But having the facts about the person isn't enough to get married. You have to take a step of trust and commit that wedding day. That's where you step out that wedding day, where you really take that volitional element and you take a step of trust or fidelity or commitment to your spouse, right? And that's very important, because if you think about it, all the commitments we make in life, major commitments, we may gather the facts and about a job possibility or something like that, or where we want to live and move, where we want to live and be, and what major to pick in career. But we still have to commit. They all involve commitments where we had to move beyond the cognitive aspect and we had to really step out and trust, right? And make that commitment. So a good definition of biblical faith is trust or confidence in something that's based on knowledge or good reasons. Okay. As I just said, if you think about every commitment that you make in life, whether it be marriage or where to live, what job to take, what to eat, what repair shop to use, where to vacation, how to invest your money, where to go to church, generally you have some good reasons for committing to these things. I'd be willing to bet if someone asked you why you committed to these things, you have some reasons, right? And so you need to think about it. When you commit to Jesus, to follow Jesus, hopefully you have some reasons for that. I assume most of us do. Now, it is true that when we come to faith the first time, we actually make that initial commitment. The only thing we may know, or the only reason we have for doing that, is that we believe the gospel. Someone presented the gospel to us, realized we have a sin problem, and we believe that Jesus is who he is, and that's the reason. I mean, Jesus needs to save us from our sins, and he needs to rescue us. So that's okay. But as time goes on in your Christian faith, as the years go by, months go on, you're going to need to really work on more reasons. Like, why have you embraced this thing, and how do I explain this to others? So obviously you've got, and that happens generally as you mature in your faith. Hopefully you're building your knowledge base, on some of the reasons you've chosen to be a Christian or follow Jesus. The knowledge base builds and builds. And so reasons or evidence definitely supports our faith, right? The object of our faith is God and Jesus, and reasons and evidence supports that. But we don't worship evidence. I mean, some people are fixated on evidence. We can give reasons or evidence, but that's not the object of our faith. The object of our faith is God and Jesus, and reasons or evidence supports what we believe. Now, think about the apostles, the first followers of Jesus. What reasons did they have for their faith? Did they have any? Or did they just walk into the synagogue in the book of Acts and say, I've had a changed life. Watch how I live my life, and you can be a follower of Jesus as well? In other words, did they do lifestyle kind of evangelism? No, they didn't. They didn't do a lot of that. They had very specific reasons for their faith. And most of the time, if you read through the book of Acts and elsewhere, they appealed a lot to Old Testament Messianic prophecy, they appeal to promises in the Old Testament are fulfilled by Jesus, as F. Bruce talked about in his book, that's kind of a bit older now, but it's still a classic, The Defense of the Gospel in the New Testament. So they definitely had, their faith was based on what, God had done by fulfilling these promises in Jesus. You can read texts all throughout in Acts about Messianic prophecy where they're appealing to the Jewish scriptures and debate and talking to people, witnessing to people. They are definitely, thinking that one of the main reasons they've chosen to follow Jesus is he fulfills things from the Old Testament. Then, of course, they believe that Jesus was a Messiah based on the resurrection. They had seen him, witnessed the event, and that was another reason they claimed to have the faith that they had, the trust that they had based on the resurrected Jesus. Now, we weren't there to see that, but of course, we trust their testimony. We think they're telling the truth, and that's one of the reasons we're believers as well. Of course, we think Jesus rose from the dead. That's imperative to our faith. And then, of course, you see in the book of John, at the end of John 20, where John ends his gospel with the following claim. He said, it says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So John clearly gives reasons why he wants them to believe. These are the things I've recorded about Jesus, the miracles he did, the evidence he gave for who he was, and that's why I want you to believe. So he wants you to believe, have faith or trust or fidelity or commitment based on the work of Jesus and the evidence that he's given in his gospel. Now, what about the passage in Hebrews 11, 1-3, where it says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtain a good testimony. By faith we understand that the worlds are formed by the word of God, so that things are seen were not made of things which are visible. So a lot of people butcher this passage. They just look at the first line, they take it out of context, where it says faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, and then they go off on a tangent saying, see, faith is blind. It's all blind. It's the evidence of things not seen. They don't even read the rest of the chapter, which you need to do in Bible study. You don't want to take one line out of context. That's not how you study the Bible. You can do that, but you end up making all kinds of wrong conclusions. So if you want to keep doing it, do it. But you probably don't know what you're talking about when you try to come to wrong conclusions. You look silly. So in Bible study interpretation, you always want to read the context. So when we read Hebrews 11 in context, you read on after verse 1, it talks about all these people. They trusted God, even though they couldn't see the future completely, but they had seen God already act in their lives. They had knowledge of who God was. They trusted him and had fidelity, commitment to the one true God because they had already seen God act. They had, so when they took these steps of trust, as it lists in Hebrews 11, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Rahab, others, they already had a relationship with God. They had knowledge of God. So they weren't going on any kind of blind faith. They had no idea who God was or anything. They had no evidence at all. They had evidence of who God was. They'd seen him work in their lives. Now, it's true, they couldn't see the final outcome, like when they were obeying God, but they still stepped out, obviously, and had trust. And then sometimes we need to remember that the leap of faith, that phrase, it actually, a lot of times it's traced back to Søren Kierkegaard, who is a Danish philosopher. And he never really used the phrase leap of faith. He used the phrase leap to faith. He was an existentialist, Kierkegaard, a Christian, but he looked at some of the different schools of thought at that time, empiricism, rationalism, and he realized, that we're not going to get all the way to God through empirical observation or strong rational argumentation. He believed you needed to eventually just take the leap to faith because, you just can't bridge the gap completely with those arguments. I mean, you can use them, they're there, but it's not going to take you all the way. So you need to take a leap to faith. And you almost run into, he thinks what's an existential crisis where you have to act. You need to take a step of trust, okay? So some people think the leap of faith It's kind of like when you think it's related to something like the Indiana Jones movie, The Last Crusade, the third one they did, where Indiana Jones, steps out to cross that bridge and it's not there, and then he just believes and the bridge appears. But that is something that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about biblical faith. But that's what some people think leap of faith is. It's very similar to that. Or you could have people out there in the Christian churches saying that reason is the greatest enemy that faith has. These people are misled, as you can see. But no, you have reasons for your faith. You can't divorce reason from your faith commitments. There's no way you could do that. But you just need to understand that the relationship between faith and reason is certainly something you can study, but it doesn't have to be an either or. If you're out there, you're thinking that, well, I need to have faith, I need to trust God, and reason's an enemy. If I think through it too much, I'm not going to have any faith. Now, it's true that you could do that. You could just basically rationalize what God's asking you to do, take a step of faith. You could disobey him, but that's not the same thing as saying there's no reasons for why I'm following God, and there's no reasons why I think Jesus is a Messiah. I mean, no, you have reasons for that. You should, okay? Otherwise, it would be blind faith, but that's not what it is. Now, Jesus says in John 20, blessed are those who have not seen yet have believed. Some people think this verse, taken out of context again, refers to blind faith. Now, if you read on at the end of John, and then he goes on to say, therefore many signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these have been written so you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So you need to read it, and don't want to read that verse out of context. And also in the rest of John, if you read other passages in John, Jesus did specific things to show who he was, his miracles. He did works. He showed his miracles are proof, right? In John 5:36, John 10:37-38, John 14:11. He even says in John 14:11, or he says in John 5:36, the works which the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works I do, testify about me, the Father sent me. And notice in John 10, he says, if you do not believe me, believe the works I do. He's saying, look at my actions. This is evidence for who I am. So I think what Jesus is doing, he rebukes Thomas in John 20. Thomas is the one who has to touch his wounds. And Jesus says, blessed are those who do not see. I think he really expected Thomas to trust the testimony of the other disciples, because remember the disciples said, we've seen Jesus, and Thomas wouldn't believe. So, just remember that you want to read that passage in context, okay, the John 20 text. Let's say you still deal with someone that says, I can't see God, faith in God is blind. Once again, they don't have a great definition of who God is or what God is, because if it's the God of the Bible, it's a good thing we can't see God directly. And there's a lot of things we can't see directly. You know that? You can't use your five senses. You can't see electrons directly, or protons directly, or neutrons directly, or individual atoms, or electric fields, or magnetic fields, or gravitational fields. You can't see justice directly, and you can't see consciousness of other human beings directly, and you can't see the wind directly. None of those things are directly visible to you. What you do see are the effects of these things. You see the effects of justice in the world, right? There's no justice molecule you're seeing directly, right? And you don't see the wind directly. You see the effects of the wind, like on the branch when it's blowing, right? You don't see protons or neutrons or any of those things directly. That's why when someone says, well, I can infer the existence of electrons by the behavior of charged particles, or you can infer the existence of electronic fields or magnetic fields by the behavior of charged particles, I would say, yes, that's right. You can infer those things, and that's the way we know God exists as well. We infer God's existence through his effects in the world, which are all around us. We can't see God directly, but we can see the effects of God, okay? Now, some people think having biblical faith means to have 100% certainty. That is not true. Biblical faith is not always to have the highest degree of psychological confidence. As I say, number one here, instead it is to be persuaded enough that the claims of Jesus are true, and one adopts the Christian story as their own and lives under the lordship of Jesus. Now, as you know, as I say, number two here, when you make commitments, You may not have the highest level of confidence. You may have some confidence. You may have great confidence. You may have low confidence. I don't know. But only you know what level of confidence satisfies you. But you may still have some doubts. Doubt, there's no way you can divorce faith from doubt, because if every doubt you had was answered perfectly 100%, there would be no room for faith at all. Okay? So these people that shoot for 100% certainty in everything are probably going to miss it every time. You can have reasonable certainty. You can have high confidence. You can have, good reasons for believing what you believe. But it doesn't mean you have to have 100% certainty and no doubt. That is not what biblical faith is. It is true that in the Bible, Jesus sometimes rebukes people for not trusting God and not believing in his promises, right? They're doubting there, and he rebukes them for that. And that's true. Sometimes we just need to trust God, and maybe, we're not trusting him, and we need to do that. But when it comes to dealing with questions about Christianity, whether it's true and apologetics and all these issues, apologetics is not designed to just get rid of all the doubt in the world. That's not what apologetics is designed to do. It can't do it. There will always be questions. You will not know everything exhaustively. You'll have some gaps of knowledge, and that's okay. That's the way most people live, and just learn to live with it. Okay, it's not the end of the world. So unless you just don't understand what we're saying, I mean, if you're shooting for 100% certainty in every single thing, you just can't get, or like, I just cannot get the certainty that I want. Perhaps you take a step back and ask yourself, how much certainty do you have in your other areas of your life? When you committed to your spouse? Are you committed to a job? Are you committed to a certain city to live in? Are you committed to a degree? You're committed to a vocation, or whatever it is. You might have had some certainty, but I doubt you had 100% certainty, but you still made a commitment. Okay? So don't shoot so high. Okay? You don't need to shoot that high. And I'm not saying you don't know anything. I'm not saying that you can't answer your questions or get your questions answered. I'm just saying don't shoot as, maybe you need to lower it a little bit. Okay? And, also when someone comes to me or to you and they say they no longer believe God exists or Jesus is the Son of God, they say, I don't believe it anymore. I just don't believe it. Whether they believe God exists or not has no bearing on whether he exists. God was around and he existed before you believed. Okay. And he still exists if you don't believe it. Your faith does not make God exist. Right? Faith is not faith in faith. Like if I believe hard enough that there's Martians out on my lawn right now Martians eating marshmallows in my backyard, I could believe as hard as I can, but that doesn't mean that those Martians are there, right? They're either there or they're not there. Okay? They were already there to begin with, or they're not there. I either believe or I don't. But that does not, definitely does not, your faith does not make God exist, okay? So when someone comes to me and they say no longer believe it, I'm like, so you just change your psychological state. That doesn't change whether God exists or not, or whether Jesus is his son. And your faith has no bearing on whether Jesus rose from the dead. He either rose from the dead or he didn't rise from the dead. It's an historical claim, right? Just like if you say John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln. It either happened or it didn't happen. Your faith doesn't have any bearing on that, okay? So that's the difference between objective truth and subjective truth, by the way. Something objective is outside yourself, right? It's something that is in reality that has no bearing, has no relationship to your feelings, your emotions, your preferences, right? It's an objective truth, okay? And then finally, remember that a lot of us can have a circumstantial faith, and that's where our trust in God is challenged through circumstances, but generally God is only good if these things are in place. They're working well, or these things that we find our identity in, perhaps our career, relationships, possessions, various roles. And when those things are threatened, sometimes we just fall into a circumstantial faith, like everything's based on circumstances, and somehow we need to get to the point where we're able to trust God in those circumstances. We're not going to be ruined or absolutely dominated by circumstances. I know it's very challenging sometimes, but just remember, we need to try not to just simply have a circumstantial faith, right? So having said that, that's about it for now in defining faith and looking at it. I hope this helps you in your conversations with others and in your own discipleship. And we will be back next week. Have a good week.